Okay, yeah.
Okay, great. Let's get started. So, welcome again, everyone. For those who have been to our previous patio sessions, you kind of know the drill, but if you haven't, well, welcome and thanks for being here. We do these sessions on a monthly basis, and there is a different theme each month. And as you know, PATIO stands for Platform for Architectural Transfers in the Indian Ocean Rim. So we're really interested in kind of issues around architecture and the built environment in this entire kind of region. And we kind of think of the region as a little bit more broad, as you will see from the discussion today. But today our theme is built environment pedagogy. And my name is Priya Jain. I am an associate professor of architecture at Texas A&M University. And I'm the theme director of this theme along with Parul Kiri Roy, who is a professor at the School of Planning and Architecture. And in this theme, we look at a historical analysis of the discourse within and about education and methodology in architectural, engineering, and vocational institutions in the Indian Ocean Rim, which includes the transcultural structures of exchange of personnel, ideas, and pedagogic models. Under this theme, one could consider the educational institutes, as we have sometimes in the past, and we will talk about that a little bit today as well. But as well as, just pedagogical models and, the role of educators and just, how we kind of have talked about pedagogy in this wider region, both historically and the ramifications it has in the current time. So with that, let's get started. We'll follow our standard kind of format, which means that we have two speakers who will have about 10 to 15-minute presentations, and then we have an invited respondent who will provide some comments. And after that, we'll open it up to a wider discussion. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to include them in the chat button, and then we will take them up towards the end after we're done with the presentations and the invited comments. So with that, let's get started with our first speaker. First up, we have Farhan Karim. Farhan Karim's research interests span a wide range within modern and contemporary architecture in South Asia, encompassing themes such as climate change, decolonization, radical pedagogy, and participatory design. He is the author of Greater Dignity Than Riches, Austerity and Housing Design in India, published in 2019, and has contributed as an editor to works including The Routledge Companion to Architecture and Social Engagement, Flows, Boundaries, and the Construction of Muslim Cells since 1900, and Memorial Reproduction of 1971 in Contemporary Bangladesh. Along with his recently co-edited book that he will discuss today, which is architectural education in the history of architectural education in the Middle East and North Africa. Farhan has served as president and vice president of the Society of Urban and Architectural Historians of Asia, and his academic journey includes fellowships at institutions such as the Canadian Center for Architecture, Aga Khan Foundation at MIT, Dumbarton Oaks at Harvard, and the Zentrum Moderner Orient in Berlin. Welcome, Farhan.
Thank you very much, Priya, and thank you very much the PATI organizers to organize and organize such a beautiful series of talks, and especially inviting me to share my thoughts and ideas. So let me share my screen first. Uh, I do not. I mean that I do have a very brief presentation. I know that it's the format is mostly like a conversation, and I only will take 10 to 12 minutes just to present the main questions that I'm trying to deal in my works regarding architectural pedagogy. So before I specifically discuss about my books or my essays, I want to kind of discuss the three broad questions that I want to address in my work regarding architectural pedagogy. So on one level, when we talk about architectural education and pedagogy, it is about tracing the history of the institutional development of architectural education, its curriculum development, and its underlying political context or socioeconomic context against which these institutions has developed across the decolonial world, and its relationship with the evolving political landscape of these countries. So on the surface level, it so, some chat. I'm not very sure. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes,
Okay.
we can,
Yes, we can
Farhan.
hear
We're
you.
just sharing some links. Yes.
Okay. Sure. So, but methodologically, I want to tackle three main questions in my work. Number one, and is the way that I understand architectural pedagogy, which is a framework for me, which is a framework through which particular forms of knowledge, representation, and practice are recognized and legitimized as architecture. So it's basically about it's for me it's an epistemological discussion how we define what architecture is, because for me we have been building. I mean that historically we have been building for quite a long time, no, as organizing builders or organizing designers, but in our area of investigation, which is the modern time, in the contemporary time, here when the institution has developed, and pedagogy essentially giving us a framework to define what we understand is as architectural knowledge, mainstream architectural knowledge. So it is a boundary condition. It's a structural boundary condition that excludes some knowledge from others and defines some knowledge as being architectural and some being non-architectural. So how these institutions define these boundaries, boundaries and differences between different forms of knowledge, is one of my interest. How these decolonial institutions have been doing that. So in this sense, pedagogy shapes the intellectual and cultural boundaries of architecture itself, and how this boundary making process, we have been doing it in the decolonial context, is one of my interests. The second one is pedagogy functions as a means of defining the architect itself. I mean, that who is architect and what is the definition of architect, in the modern time. So it's not only about curriculum, but it is a collective way of the educators and the practitioners to imagine the role of architect and its relationship to society, the profession's relationships to society. Through educational structures, institutional priorities, and disciplinary values, architectural pedagogy constructs the ideas about the social responsibility of architects and their ethical obligations, and which is very relevant when it comes to the context of decolonization, and especially in the transformative eras of decolonial educations, architects' ethical and social responsibility with society, and how we define that role through pedagogical framework. And the third one, architectural pedagogy provides the methodological framework through which architecture knowledge is translated into practice. I mean, how we operate in the real world. So when we teach our students in the curriculum, so we also imagine how those knowledge that we define through these institutions as architecture, how those knowledge is going to put into practice. So how we are going to translate these in the real world, meaning that theoretical knowledge, how we transform theoretical knowledge into an operative mode or operational knowledge. So how that what is that methodological tool. So by determining how architects train to observe, analyze, imagine, and intervene, pedagogy influences how architecture is produced and experienced in society. So these are the three main questions or interests that I want to address in my work. So and recently I have published three. For some reason, one of the images is not appearing. So three essays, which is related to architectural pedagogy. The first one came out in the project of Independence Architecture Decolonizations Catalog, in which I tried to kind of give a survey of the development of institutions in decolonial South Asia. One of the main thing that I wanted to focus in this essay is when in the transformative eras, how these institutions reimagine its historic position in the new time. What do I mean is that many of these institutions, they have its colonial legacy. Many of these institutions has started with the in the colonial time, with the transition through the decolonial process, when these institutions reimagine their role, how do they define history, right? And one of my main interests was to see that how the curriculum of history, architectural history, changes in these institutions, and how this changed or renewed architectural curriculum, which did not happen over time, over over a period of over decades, and how this realignment in history continuity, that how that also influenced design studios and design practice. So that is something that I wanted to discuss in this essay. The second one, an essay that came out in the book, it's kind of edited book by named Radical Pedagogies, edited by a group of people, including Beatriz Colomena. So in which I focus on one institute, which is Bangladesh University of Engineering and Technology, after and which was previously was East Pakistan University of Engineering and Technology, and which was previously during the colonial time was Asanullah Engineering and Technology Asanullah School of Engineering and Technology. So the same institute that went through three different phases in the British period, then the Pakistan period, and then the Bangladesh period. And I was looking at the curriculum and trying to trace that how architectural pedagogy evolve over this three period, and especially when it comes to the treatment of history in design teaching, meaning that how history was incorporating in the design studio exercise. Like especially I was looking at one of the studios which was taught by an American architect, Daniel Dunham, who was part of the design team of the Komlapur railway station. I was particularly looking at his studios, and I was trying to see that how he used architectural history, historical building, and historical education in his design studios, and try to redefine through his studio what will be the role of architect in Pakistan. I mean, that studio was basically in Pakistan. In Pakistan, how this new decolonial architect can serve the country. So, and the last work that I think that I'm kind of over the time. Sorry about that. So the last book that I co-edited with Muhammad Gharipur, and in which we focus on the areas of Middle East and North Africa. The key questions remaining the same, but now we are looking at a set of different institutes, and we have, since it's a co-edited book, so we have invited our colleagues who are specialized on those areas and try to see that how the three questions that I posed at the beginning of my talk, how these questions are addressed in different parts, in different regions, and different institutes. I will just very briefly try to present to you the three broad sections of this book. So we have divided the essays into three broad sections. Number one is the new history consciousness, in which our colleagues they were trying to see that how during the time of the process of decolonizations in the post-colonial time, how these schools and these institutions and the educators realign with a new history consciousness. I mean, the new history stream. So a new history begin after there in the discursive world, in the discourse, they imagine that a new history has started, a new history stream has started, and how these institutions now must realign itself with this new history, and how this realignment might change the architectural education. So that was the first part. The second part was quite interesting, what we're calling the resolving modernity. A lot of this institution, what I have observed in South Asia and also observed in Middle East and North Africa, is how to deal with the questions of modernity, right? I mean, modernism, on the one hand, it was a Western construct. It was a kind of totalitarian way to change everything, every culture. Do not That does not account the regional context, etc. That is one part of modernity. But on the other hand, modernity was in the decolonial world. Modernity was also gave a new language or vocabulary to express the new countries, the new post-colonial countries. So how to balance and reconcile these two sides of modern? How to resolve this? On the one hand, it is a metaphor or symbol of westernization, but on the other hand, it is also a post-colonial language. How to reconcile that? So the institutions tackle these questions in various ways. The introduction of the regionalism, the contextual modernism, situated modernism, many different architectural vocabulary emerged and popped within architectural curriculum, and that is a second. And in these sections, our colleagues, they have dealt with that ideas. And the third one is the knowledge exchange. Again, the first question that I posed at the beginning, that what knowledge or is considered as architecture and what knowledge is considered not as architecture. I mean, sometimes we create this differentiation between vernacular knowledge, vernacular building practice, and architectural, mainstream architecture knowledge. Where to make these, boundaries, and we were trying to look at this differentiation, how this differentiations was practiced over the time in the institutions. Sometimes we have created new courses like vernacular architecture to include some of this knowledge and practice within mainstream studios. Sometimes the institution exclude vernacular architecture or other forms of knowledge altogether in their curriculum. So one of our main questions to see that how institutions change the way that they understand different forms of knowledge, and how that reflect in that thing in their curriculum. So I think I will stop here, Priya, and hopefully we will have more questions, and we can go from there. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Farhan. Next up, we have Dr. Amrita Madan, who is a multidisciplinary design practitioner and architect, educator, researcher, design thinker, and academic leader. Amrita has taught architecture and design since 2002, conducting undergraduate and postgraduate studios in India and France. She has held several leadership positions at various institutions, including campus director and professor at UID NCR, and design track director and associate dean at the Sushant School of Architecture. Professor Madan has a keen interest in the crossover between fields of creative thinking in the making of space, experientiality, design thinking, and narrative-based design methodologies. In her 20-year practice at Atelier Anonym Design, a multidisciplinary design firm, Amrita has worked as a creator, thinker, designer, conduit, and wrangler of space for a variety of experiential design projects. Welcome, Amrita.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm just going to share my presentation. Yeah, can you see? Is it visible?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So thanks, Farhan, for that lovely, I don't know, I mean, it's sort of, there are so many alignments between what you were talking and what I'm going to be talking about. So you literally helped me situate myself better. So good morning, good afternoon, and evening to everyone over here. I'm just going to start diving in. Like I was introduced by Priya, having practiced and taught and researched in the area of architectural pedagogy and education. My work seeks to interpret these so-called components of the architectural discipline, which are, intertwined through the project as holistic entities. Contrary to what Farhan was talking about, the architecture history curriculum, I'm talking about the project and how the project has actually been dealt with, and what is the relationship that has been created between how the studio, the site, and the society link together. So that is what my talk is titled. I'm looking at it through a 40+ year window towards the scholarship in this area to begin with a special focus on the Indian situation. So traditionally, this relationship has been looked at as a linear one. The studio, that is the education, readies you for the site, which is the practice, which in turn prepares you or amplifies the engagement with the society. It is to be noted that the term society here is interpreted very loosely. It means client, users, and such, those who are influenced by the project, rather than the entire social ecosystem. As opposed to this, I look at the architect, or rather architecture, as a unique melting pot where the studio, site, and society coalesce, where the architecture that results is influenced and in some way bleeds into these three, and in this constant push and pull. My attempt here is to reframe the practice, education, and the relationship as a situated, plural, and political construct, proposing a more grounded mode of learning, one that treats the studio as a site of negotiation between these global frameworks and the local realities. Before I go into the work itself, a little bit about how the scholarship regarding this idea has grown over the last 40 years, or changed rather, over the last 40 years. This was an extensive review of the scholarship. I had 560 plus documents, research articles, about 60%, conference papers, book chapters, reviews, editorials, books, all coalesced into this initial understanding of how this relationship is growing. As you can see, there is minimal scholarship in the first 20 years of this phase, and it is towards this 21st century where the scholarship suddenly booms. There's a concern for architectural education and pedagogy that grows. We're discussing methods and issues that were previously considered sacrosanct. In a way, architectural education has become more accessible as a subject matter. This can also be seen when you look at the range of scholars who have engaged with the idea. Of course, the UK, US, Australia are taking precedence, but the global South also making its presence felt over these years. It's key. There's a key point that we can notice, that it is since around 2000 that the global South got activated, engaging with models such as critical pedagogy, the situated knowledge, experiential learning that were anchored in their unique contexts, rather than in the teacher-centered pedagogy modes and hidden curricula modes that were previously, the talk of the town. So this sort of background to how the scholarship evolved led me to understanding what were the various ways in which these ideas were linking together. This network visualization shows the various ideas across those 560 papers, and you can see a very small point over here, which is a blown up view of that cluster, which is the professional practice cluster, where you see that how that is a unique item in this whole entity, and it's linking across to ideas of sustainability, engineering education, project-based learning, project problem solving. These are the kind of ideas that are being introduced into it. A detailed visualization of about 91 entries, which were identifying the themes between the relationship between the studio, site, and society, was then constructed. And you can see the mapping showed curricula, experiential learning, design knowledge, virtual reality, live projects, participatory, interdisciplinary, design build. These are the words that are keywords that are kind of being encountered primarily across within this scholarship. So looking at this scholarship through this chronological setting and through these lenses of pedagogy, the disciplinary approaches, and the theoretical underpinnings, revealed few overall themes. One was the concern for the real. I'll get into it further. But the concern for the real, as well as the second one, was the fragmentation and the defragmentation of the discipline. Every time something happened, we are talking about how the discipline, what all it includes, what all it excludes, what can, how those boundaries are pushing and pulling, and what changes. So based on this, the conversation that is happening is about primarily these 5 pedagogic uh, periods. I'm talking globally over here, where we're moving from the teacher-centric or the cultural capital hidden curriculum to critical pedagogy later, moving in some 12 pedagogic categories, which was spanning this entire 40 years. And as we saw, a vast array of points of origin across from the earlier slide. Sometimes these models were proposed to be inward looking, they were reflective, or they were purely self referential. And sometimes they were outward looking, situating or questioning the discipline's societal values. Overall, the pedagogic approach has gone from being tacit to being more and more explicit, from unidirectional to multifarious or multidisciplinary and collaborative, and from orthodox to radical. So this has, the argument that the content, the substantive content of the profession, there is a link between the education of architecture and the projected multidisciplinary future roles of the architect. How these kind of two things can link together. This is an argument that I have taken in this in my work. And the total, understanding of the pedagogical, categories is vast, but it's also it's important to note that these are actually going in tandem with larger pedagogic debates for most part. And sometimes they are in isolation with the larger pedagogic debates. I'm saying outside of architecture. There's a lot of borrowing and in some cases, lending going on. But very often there is also isolation. We are talking just within ourselves, and we are not actually relating it to the larger, educational scenarios. So I want to then further link these pedagogic phases and what happens in the studio with what's happening across in terms of the professional shifts and what's happening across at various points of these 40 years, starting with the end of modernism and the rise of postmodernism, which is reflected through diverse ranges of influences, critical theory, semiotics, social theory, to the digital revolution, which is talking about globalization and boundaries again between architecture, art, technology are beginning to blur, to the 2000s, which are talking about sustainability, ecological concerns in the professional paradigm, to interdisciplinary collaborative approaches in and socially driven architecture, socially driven context relevant debates, to now in the 2020s, where we are talking about technology, AI, and human responsibility. Taking you back a little bit to basically make the point that, as you can see, that there is a lag between the architectural outcomes in the pedagogy with respect to what's going on in the profession. It's about a 10-year lag every time it sort of keeps coming up. The digital revolution starts making its position in the pedagogy with the similar lag. Sustainability concerns bring in, and I'm talking in a larger sense. We're talking all of this coming into the pedagogy at a later date. So this sort of what begins in such an insular way, where methods in teaching and learning and architecture are literally examined, has evolved into a comprehensive exploration of cultural significance, social responsibilities, interdisciplinary dynamics. So with this background moving, I mean, the question remains that the 2020 will lead to what kind of architectures and 2010s, as we can see today, have created a lot of internal questioning. Diving deeper into these various phases, the teacher-centered pedagogy phase was essentially talking about the relationship between practice and education as one which was driven through relation of practice in the culture of the studio. So it was where we were talking about how the studio is the place to practice how to be in practice. So the juries are meant to talk about, give us a purview into client, facing clients, and this kind of debate where literally the forms of practice were actually integrated into the studio. This is what was going on. Yet there was also some, critical thinking ideas of democracy and social awareness which were taking place within that scholarship. And so the key tension during this time was between the professional induction of what what is the purpose of that, the curriculum, almost vocational, to the critical reform, really talking about education for the sake of education rather than just as a service to the profession, in a sort of a one-way relationship. At this time, the global south, the scholarship in global south, there was not a lot of scholarship which was existing. It was loosely aligned with apprenticeship logics. There was an effort to talk about on-site formal craft-based realities, but it was also something that was actually being, there was a lot of still a very strong colonial, hangover, and we were borrowing heavily from this. In fact, there was not a lot of thought being given to what it could be beyond that. At that moment in India, it was a very, very interesting time where architecture education was changing drastically. New schools were opening up, as you can see, from 45 in the early 90s. By late 90s, the number had blown. Before that, it was just 17. And these new schools were talking about new ways of being. So there were two kinds of individuals who were leading this now. Those who had graduated from homegrown institutes, SPA, JJ, or engineering schools, they were propagating mostly engineering mindset. And those who had probably gone and done their higher education studies outside in various Western institutions, who were actually seeing where is this leading, what does it mean. Alternate methods were being discussed. Very few, yet in that milieu of the 90s plus schools, very few were actually discussing something beyond. And most of these people the scholarship also was actually dominated by the thinking practitioner teachers who had studied at these various institutions. In the profession, there was actually active considerations around the idea of critical regionalism in the projects, as well as in education. The conversations were centered around diversity of the country, and regionally driven architectural education. Interestingly, these conversations were more about creating a singular framework for the country, which then architectural education, Council of Architecture picked up much later and made a unified approach and sort of put it on all the schools, and that also created certain kind of disparities later. In the next phase, which can be, we can understand it as an amalgamation between two subphases. A transitioning phase where the pushes and pulls between the two sides of the discipline are keenly felt, and a consolidating phase where we're talking about situated learnings and context, everyday reality, globally, service to society. The key tensions then shifted from the push and pull from real world readiness versus academic experimentation, and to a give and take between the autonomous design culture and social responsibilities. Now, at this point, Global South was the scholarship across the Global South was actually talking more about had come up, had increased, and it started engaging with the ideas of the digital, collaborative, sensorial in parts. There was an unease with the dominant narrative. And it was interesting that there's a lot of digital was coming in at this point by the Global South. In fact, most of the digital narrative about how practice is actually using these, softwares and developing this is something that the education should then do, sort of a reversal of that relationship was actually a Global South scholarships narrative. Yet the context of how to address informality, rapid urbanization, uneven resources, these were hardly discussed across in the Global South. In the Indian context, this period actually saw a lot of reflection by various thinkers, scholars around the idea of relevance, identity, society, the profession. These questions were again considered sacrosanct. We had taken that engineering mindset as a given, as a deference to that Western worldview. But now we were questioning its relevance for the Indian society. Architecture education discourse was described as something that needed a lot of reform. These two scholars and practitioners and people engaged with education, I mean, these two quotes are actually quite telling, where we're talking about the interrelationship between technology, ethics, social aspirations of diverse communities. So the idea of diversity was actually very much at the core of this debate of the Indian diversity. The debate in the profession was very limited. There was in the profession a very complete absence of a homegrown criticality, and there was a disconnect with the larger society in general. In the next two phases, this two sub-phases of the 2010s, the first phase concretized this approach of collaboration technology with a lot of design build exercises coming up, studios coming up, schools being defined around design build as a construct. Holistic relationship between education, practice, society. This identifying this kind of tug of war between maintaining the disciplinary identity and addressing crucial problems. We didn't know what our role was, and so we were experimenting as to what it could mean for the society in general. And in the second phase, this sort of hybrid and the collaborative really, kind of deepened, where technology was being used as a medium to understand. Some were more ready to change. People, there was readiness for change in some ways, and some ways they were digging in deep to actually explore experiential learning and local understandings. So this, very ethical considerations in the Global South about labor representation impact sort of created a very interesting, again, I would say, I'll keep using the word push and pull between this relationship, between practice, society, the site, studio, and in the middle of this, the Indian scenario actually took a turn for the worse. Very, very difficult phase in which the country decided, it was decided that there's going to be 463 schools by 2020. We were struggling still with the engineering mindset. The common narrative was that civil engineers were superior to architects because they were science-based. The system vacillated, allowing who to allow, who not to allow, who to include, who not to include, who to exclude. And at the same time, the university system across the country sort of consolidated. So the Indian university, the universities, all the architecture schools were absorbed into the university system. They were no longer autonomous, and hence the teacher was no longer a practicing architect, or and the scholarship had not developed enough for it to be, to drive this period. So there was a very stark absence of multidisciplinarity because of that engineering mindset. Only architects can teach architecture is still something that I think we struggle with in the country. And Architecture was then actually literally the younger cousin of engineering. It was no longer a material that was influencing culture, society, as it was earlier. So this growth of schools, the lack of, there is a scholarship that's growing, but it's in isolation. It's in bubbles. It little integration happens across, education and practice. There are absolutely very limited, if at all, maybe one or two socially driven models that have been, attempted at. Maybe one or two schools have done that, but it has not come into the mainstream. You can see out of those 463 schools, if only two do that, then you are literally, it's not happening. So these structural issues, this rapid growth, students were lacking, often lacked this hands-on experience, and poor integration of academic learning and professional practice. I would specifically talk about the role of research at this point, because research could have been seen as a bridge between practice and education, but because the research paradigm of the country had not yet developed in India, there was a lot of struggle to understand what it meant, and very often you would have people looking down upon researchers, and people who didn't get anything else to do coming into teaching. So there's a lot of mismatches that have taken place. So just consolidating globally, in the last 10 to 15 years, scholarship has recognized that it's not possible to look at education as a separate as entity from the profession or the society. We have moved from professional imitation to one of criticality, collaboration, and socially embedded integration. And the disciplinary nature of the discourse, as you can see in how it has evolved, is a testament to that. What begins as a reproduction is gradually transforming into a broader framework in which education responds to practice, but also reshapes the profession's social, technological, and the ethical futures. In the global south, education has shifted from the informal, tacit, craft-based learning to a more socially embedded, practice-oriented models. Scholars are often highlighting this disconnect from reality. Formal urbanization and unequal resources are constructs that we need to talk about further. In India, architectural education has grown in this, from very limited technically driven, colonially influenced institutions to hundreds of schools. But this expansion has increasingly outpaced its connection with practice and society. The post-independence conversations actually were reminiscent. It was said that we should have one curriculum. We do have, again, a one nation policy in vigor. In the 80s and 90s, the critics talked about socially engaged, context-specific, context-sensitive, ethical pedagogy. But since the 2010s, it is a completely, it has sort of broken apart with limited links to, for anything to anything. It's all in silos. There's a widening gap between the educational growth and the architectural relevance. All in all, in the global south, the studio side gap is not just pedagogical, but structural and political. And this is very interesting that if we take this reference, which is Western, then the loss of voice is inevitable. The future of architecture education lies not in exporting universal models, but in providing plural, grounded, context-specific pedagogies. This slide actually talks about this explicit, what these pedagogies could actually imply if they were to be explored now, and what could they mean in terms of their relationship with the real, with practice, with the real world. Social imperatives can lead to social agency, collaboration, inclusion, working with real world problems. Those with strong technical learning leanings can help in breaking down of those of the disciplinary silos, holistic approaches, and situated models can lead to knowledge production, epistemic inquiries. This approach to epistemic production, again, getting reminded of what Farhan started with. The where is the knowledge produced, and my work looks at knowledge produced on site, on in practice, as well as a very formal way of looking at knowledge production. This relationship which connects across the disciplinary breadth, within which knowledge is produced at the intersection of process, performer, and product. The process or the act of designing contributes to the production of knowledge using skills of problem identification, problem solving, and decision making. Product, the tangible outcome, integrates context and complexities of immediate realities, content, and attitudes and approaches towards the problem. And the performers or the designers, the stakeholders, and the entire social ecosystem, all individuals involved and at receiving end. This highlights the collaborative and multidisciplinary nature of architectural knowledge production. This proposition may be a crucial input for further empirical studies into the fractured relationship between theory and practice. And summarize.
Just in the interest of time, I wanted to ask you to, if possible, wrap up quickly so we can get
to 1-2 slides. That's it. So reframing this debate globally across the studios have evolved as a space of professional reproduction, and this shift is increasingly making the architect a mediator, collaborator, and a public actor, and moving the global south from a peripheral context to a knowledge producer could be ways by which we can look at decolonizing this debate. Again, I leave us all with these 3 questions. What forms of knowledge engages with specific informality and collective agency? What might curricula how might curricula center lived realities without instrumentalizing them? And what does practice readiness mean in contexts where the profession itself is fluid and evolving? Perhaps the question is no longer how practice informs education, but whose practices and whose histories have been allowed to define architectural knowledge itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Amrita. Thank you both for the wonderful talks. I would now like to invite Dr. Badrinarayanan Srinivasan, better known as Badri to many folks, who has worked in the design industry for a very long time. He's been a visiting faculty at the TVB School of Habitat Studies and SPA Delhi, where he developed many experimental and speculative design studios, which led to his PhD on design studio pedagogy. He has been passionately involved with academics for many years and has a PG certificate in higher education from Nottingham Trent University and a PhD in architecture from SPA New Delhi. Currently, Badri is the Dean and Director of the Jindal School of Design and Architecture, where he's leading the process of reforming the architecture and design program curricula and refining their delivery. Welcome, Badri.
Thanks, Priya. All of you can hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
So we've had 2 amazing presentations mapping the entire architectural education in developing countries in the global south. And essentially, both the presentations seem to deal with the idea of the hidden curriculum, which Thomas Dutton wrote about way back in the mid-80s and then later on right up to mid-90s. And it was taken up by other writers, including Ashraf Salama, who actually kind of operationalized it in the design studio as to how to incorporate it, how to investigate it, how to unearth it. in the design studio. So it's an ongoing discussion, and every uh, school of architecture has to deal with these questions at some point or the other. It's just that for many of the schools, these questions have again not been very explicit. They have not been stated. There have been a lot of assumptions. There have been a lot of implicit pedagogy. But from Amrita's presentation and her mapping of how education has been evolving, it looks like we are moving more towards plural and a kind of a variety of approaches rather than a singular or a 3-4 approach model. And I would like to start by asking Amrita about her two diagrams which she showed right in the beginning, where in the first diagram, the studio was, there were 3 concentric circles, whereas the first one, the central one was the studio, and then we had the site, and then you had the society. And then in the next one, it evolved where there was an architect in the center, and then there were these 3 arrows, site, society, and studio, kind of feeding into the architect. So I find these two diagrams very interesting. I would like to ask Amrita first, what really is, I mean, what does she really mean when she uses the word site? Because the studio is also a site, you know. So I would like to understand, is this a site which is understood in the normal term where a project is based on a site, etc., etc.? That is question number 1. Question number 2 is that what made you move from diagram 1 to diagram 2? Because I find that move extremely interesting. Suddenly there's the self of the architect who's in the center of the diagram, who had been so far, I think, kind of totally neglected. You know, the baggage of the architect for the last, whatever, 18, 19 years before the architect enters the architectural education suddenly seems to become important. And that also seems to kind of tie in with the overall trend of moving from an objectivist, teacher centric pedagogy to a more constructivist pedagogy, where uh, the students are allowed to explore their own contexts, their own selves, as a way of exploring architecture, the production of architecture. Yeah, if you could start with that, then we can move on. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Badri. So your first question is, what do I mean by site? Actually, by site, I think it's multiple meanings. Um, uh, I don't want to use the word practice because it's such a small way of looking at, how we can influence, what is the influence, or how what influences, a project, probably, from the lens of a project. So a site is, it's the physical site, but it's also the professional setting.
Okay.
It's that whole, the purview of what happens uh, within the work, the professional work of the architect. uh, and hence that linear path of the first one, the first diagram is actually about, is you're right, one is talking about how it has always been perceived. And if you look at it today in the Indian context, a lot of schools are still perceiving it that way, right? That
Yes.
studio, it's the studio that leads us to the site, and then we may or may not engage with society. Sometimes
Right.
the relationship actually stops short of the society. That's why I said society is also very narrowly interpreted, as being the users, or the end users, also very minimal. My work has shown that when we say we are connected with end users, it doesn't actually happen. It's the client that we are connected with, and we are very often, confusing these two words. So it's a very small interpretation of the society, which probably what bleeds into the site is what we deal with. But it's a linear relationship, and we always find ourselves as being made in the studio and then out there to influence the site and the society. Whereas the recent scholarship across the globe has actually stopped talking about it in this linear way. And one of my other slides towards the end was also talking about this relationship. I'm looking at three or four relationships came out through this. One is how education can influence profession, or how profession is inculcated within education. But the last 20 years discourse has been about the disciplinary aspect, the entire thing not being segregated as fragments, but being put together, being looked at it from the holistic sense. So that's where the second diagram comes in, and putting the architect, or I would say architecture, in the middle is about continuous responses and being a part of site, society, and studio sort of relationship. Yeah.
Right. Very interesting. Thanks.
Thank you.
And I would like to ask Farhan, thank you for your presentation. One is, you talked about decolonization. Uh, have you come across any examples where even modernism could be considered as a form of colonization, where a certain set of values are imposed on traditional ways of building, etc., etc., whereas we just take it for granted that modernism is it's outside the purview, it's something, it's the gospel, but we need to really look at the colonial hang-ups. And is it possible to do that without getting into the problematic of Orientalism? Because uh, there is another trend of making traditional things as very exotic, and getting influenced by tradition means that there's a way of validating one's work. Sometimes post facto, you design something and then 5 years later you can say that this was influenced by the traditional Haveli types, etc., etc. So there's all that going on. I do realize this is a very, very complex problem, but I would love your insights on it.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. I mean, all of these words that the word that we are using, like modernity or even tradition, heritage, this word itself has its own history. I mean, that the way that modernism terms were being approached in 1920s, 40s, 50s, 60s, in 2000, they've been keep on changing. For some, it was of course, it was for this, as you said, the so-called traditionalist modernism was a form of colonization. For some, it was the new way of expressing the new nation, right? So instead of, and there's so many different institutions and educators, they have their own ways to explain and approach this term. So I think that one way, instead of directly answering your question because it is so nuanced, let us just take it, one approach, that modernism itself has its own history, right? So this word, and we're still trying to grapple what is modernism and what is tradition, right? So, but one thing that I can just want to share, my experience and my educational institutions approach to deal with modernism and the decolonial, as you said, that what is decolonization means. So decolonization from what? Is it decolonization from the modernity as a superimposing structure that kind of universalizing the entire built environment, or decolonization from what? So that is the question. Is it is kind of decolonization from a specific style, or decolonization from a specific mode of production of knowledge, etc.? So I cannot tell, I mean, for everyone, but I can just share my own experience, that what we are trying to do in my institute, and that is kind of similar, probably relevant to our discussion today. So we do have, so this question in Arizona State University, Priya can also kind of sympathize with this approach, that we do have a specific studio on what we call the indigenous design studio, in which the Native Americans, so we have a design cell, design clusters, the Native Americans way of doing in approaching built environment, So we observe that and how we can use or borrow or can exchange the knowledge system with the mainstream, the other studios. So one approach that I take is basically designed by learning. So decolonization, meaning for me, I mean that if you ask me, so for me decolonization for me is to trying to understand uh, the material process, the material production of architecture for especially for our students, and what I have seen through my historical studies of our education institute in South Asia, that sometimes when we use the society and relationship with society and architecture is very abstract. You can even say that mystified. We do not know who is the site. It's coming to your own discussion. The site, the society is a very abstract idea. It's very much mystified and it's very much theoretical, right? That what Amrita has also been training. So how to demystify this or unpacking this relationship. And one of the approach that I have seen in historically and what we are trying to do in our institute is to unpacking the production process, material process of architecture. Just because societies sometimes can be so abstract, especially for undergrad or even grad students, looking at from where this material is coming from, who the labor process, the making of each of this building, that can unpack and demystify the production process. So I think that decolonization, for me, if you ask me, the decolonization is the decolonization of the mystified process of architecture. When architecture becomes so abstract in our design studio, it loses connections and rooting in the actual production process of each of this material, the bamboo and everything when it comes together, the fabrication process. So this is one thing that the way that I understand decolonization process, instead of going to this binary between the stylistics of modernism and tradition.
Mm.
I don't
Thank
know
you.
whether,
That really helps. No,
yeah.
no, and I perfectly, I'm aligned with whatever you have to say, because I think two things which really stand out in what you said. One is a position of humility, where you're in a position of learning from something rather than telling that this is what should be done. Instead, you take a position of humility and say that, okay, I would like to learn from the situation. So that is the position of decolonization automatically. And the second is really working with the material, with your hands, being very grounded and getting to know where each and every material is coming from, what kind of labor is involved, uh, what kind of skills are involved, and so on. So not detaching oneself from the entire process of actual building, uh, and looking at it like in a more grounded way. I think that's quite amazing. Yeah. And that's something which I also believe in, which is a kind of a demystification of, otherwise, a lot of these, terms, they become extremely abstract and become more and more obscure, you know. And I would like to, uh, mention how difficult architectural education and the production of architecture is, by quoting Wittgenstein, who is one of the greatest philosophers of this century. After writing his great treatises on philosophy, he tried to design his sister's house, and this is what he said afterwards: being a good architect is more difficult than practicing philosophy. This is what Wittgenstein had to say. So I think we can open up the floor for questions. I really don't
Sure.
have anything further. Priya?
Absolutely. Thank you, Badri, and thank you to the speakers. I think that was a great discussion. We do have some questions in the chat. So I'll probably invite Saptrishi first because he has a follow-up question for Farhan. So Saptrishi, feel free to unmute. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. It's delightful to see everybody and these presentations. I enjoyed seeing all of them. I'll refrain from commenting on Amrita's because at some point I was her doctoral supervisor very briefly. But Farhan, I wanted to pick up on what you said about how you run your studios in Arizona State, uh, because in setting forth the decolonization of architectural education, and your book definitely contributes a great deal to that conversation. Do you think that one is, of course, the material process of engaging with what unfolds on the ground, but is there also a scope of decolonizing the epistemological dimension of these? And I'm specifically talking about the languages that people use for architecture and materials and spaces and all that, because I think that there is a huge amount of responsibility on educators. Uh, I think when you're talking about the North African context, modernist architectural education might have been emancipatory in certain ways, right? But if we think of this history from the present day, how do we position ourselves who understand the terms of how buildings are done, how materials are described, and how spaces are described? And I mean, we have a Bengali heritage, so we know that a word like poribesh can actually describe so many other sort of practices and inhabitations, modes of inhabiting spaces. I mean, I was just thinking that do you think that the potential of this form of epistemological decolonization remains underexplored and it can be pushed further? I was just wondering what thoughts you had on that.
No, no, Shoptoshi, ekdom perfectly put it. So, I mean, the relationship between language and architecture is very significant. I mean that Wittgenstein's example. So the word game and how we use language has a very deep connections of how we perceive our environment or protibesh, right? And sometimes different language has very different ways of even conceiving or describing language, and that influence the architectural practice. That is again a fascinating story. Now, the challenge of American universities and Priya and of course Australian universities, where we have, I mean, that since you asked me, my personal experience. So we do have, students coming from very different background. I mean, that we do have a big Latin students, Native American first generation graduates. We have a very big South Asian, especially in Indian students. So when do they all come? And we try to, I mean, that my studios and in our courseworks, we try to address these issues, the differences of different frameworks. But at the same time, I want to also connect this with Mehwish's Abid's questions that, and it is very much related. And institutions in today's world, it also have, I think that the challenge of our institutions are that we also need to produce graduate for the market, and that is a challenge. I mean that the relationship between the institution's role to provide a sound career, what we call that placeability of our graduates, whether they can actually get a job in the real market, the market which is driven entirely by real estate forces, market forces, etc. We need to make them ready, office ready. That is one challenge, and that is a kind of conversation I think that Badri and being a dean position in the dean, that we have to tackle every day. And then the question is the radical studios. The radical studios is a way of criticizing that market force in a sense. I mean that is the tensions that the institutions are facing every day on a daily basis. Radical pedagogies, radical studios is a form of critical engagement with the market. Critics in a very much Marxist sense, that what is, how the market in the real estate market is excluding society every day, how it is mystifying the production process, how it's mystifying the global flows of material and labor, and different forms of net. So that is the real estate market. We have to produce successful candidates who can serve the market on the one hand, but at the same time, we are also trying to teach the radical critical pedagogy, how to balance with that, right? So I will stop here. I think that Badri has, I mean, that this conversation can go on forever, but
I just wanted to throw in a question here, just as a provocation for everyone. Way back in the 90s, there was a survey done of architecture schools in Europe, and they did something very fascinating. They created two axes. The vertical axis had arts and humanities on top and sciences at the bottom, and the horizontal had theory on one side and practice on the other side. So that very neatly categorized all schools into these four quadrants. So you had arts and humanities, which were practice oriented. Then you had sciences, which were practice oriented. And on the other side, you had theory and sciences, which is like more pure knowledge. And then you have theory and arts and humanities, which makes it more kind of a disciplinary, critical approach. Now, unfortunately, in our country, everything is very mean because of Council of Architecture. It's been framed towards vocation, which is basically this third quadrant of practice and sciences. But my question is that, do we really need to have one single approach within every school? What Amrita talked about plurality. So within the same school, depending on the kind of faculty you have, the kind of resources, can we have different approaches within the same school, so that this school is not known for a particular kind of a graduate with a particular kind of qualities, but there's a kind of a broad variety of graduate attributes which can be framed. Yeah, I just leave it open for everyone to think about.
Badri,
Thanks.
thanks for that question. If I could briefly jump in following from what Farhan and I were discussing, I think every school has its outliers. Perhaps I was one at SPA in the early 2000s, and they have very different experiences and trajectories. And this is also responding to what Farhan said about the market forces sort of overwhelming the pedagogical priorities, right? Because in some senses, there also is an opportunity to find convergence between some of the critical ideas that we are positioning in relation to education and the ultimate outcome of what kind of spaces these people will build, right? So I think it also comes down to a question of time, because a lot of the capitalist frameworks they concentrate time in terms of project conception and delivery. And I think that's really one of the spaces that needs to be sort of expanded in order to think about it. I mean, it can also be expanded historically, because I think a lot of I mean, I know you spoke about Africa, Farhan, and I'm thinking about Kenny Cooper's recent book about planetary design, the Earth that modernism built, and how it actually says that there are very embedded settler colonist ideologies that actually determine how we think about design and how we sort of imagine what design performs as. So, I mean, just it's not really an answer to your question, Badri, but I just thought I'd sort of put out these reflections. Anyway, I'll stop.
I'll just come in over here a bit. There's so much to say to Badri's question with respect to, is it possible? Can it be done? Is it not? Do we have to all do the same thing? And, even Saptarishi's point that, these alternate trajectories do exist, which is also true. But the system per se is not designed for those trajectories to exist. They exist despite the system, right? In spite of the system, they exist, right? But the system is actually geared towards this one singular way of looking at things. And I think the problem is deeper than that. Today, we don't have enough teachers, faculty who are versed either in the production of space or in or in any kind of scholarly pursuits, and then we are also told that, like I said, only architects can teach architecture. Very few you have what is called the adjunct or whatever faculty who can be other than architects. So it's a very small minuscule percentage. The whole system is geared towards a singular approach, and I think the problem is deeper. It's many, who's allowed to come in. Only kids with who've done physics, chemistry, and maths can come in to that. So there's a whole series of things which is saying that education is just a sweatshop for practice. And most practitioners are lamenting that students who come out don't know how to design or build buildings, right? It's a singular job, and our 5 years of education treats those 5, 10 projects that we do in a similar way. There is no exploration, there is no variety. So we are basically just teaching them larger typologies and telling them now go design. I mean, and our students don't know how to think critically. They are just, in the guise of learning by doing, they are repeating what they already know, what they've learned in the last semester. So a lot of problems, but yeah, I mean, many things can be said further.
Thank you all. We still have about 10 minutes, so folks, we still have some time to talk about questions. I just wanted to, for the video, because I don't think the chat actually translates to our videos, just to say that Farhan was responding to Mehvish about Abid's question about the limits of radical pedagogies once they become institutionalized. So I don't know, Farhan, if you or anybody else wanted to add to that question, but it was asking about, we've been talking about Amrita's presentation tracked, this kind of move away from kind of more passive ways of teaching to more socially engaged teaching. But I think the idea was, if they're still being offered within an institutional framework, right, how do they then become institutionalized and stop being radical, right? So I think we've talked about it, but I just wanted to say that is what some folks were responding to. And I wanted also acknowledge, I think, Isaac Matthews' question about this tension between the understanding of architecture as an engineering discipline versus an art discipline. And I think we've seen that kind of across the globe. And I agree with all the conversations here that these are, conversations we have in the schools here. And I think what maybe we could talk about is how are some of the pedagogic tools that we have come up with to respond to these questions? How effective are they? Are they kind of token exercises and kind of, as I may be misreading this, but I think, Farhan, as you were kind of suggesting, this kind of studio on indigenous architecture, right? Does it actually serve the purpose? At A&M, we have service learning studios where we have an actual kind of community client that the students get to engage with and design for, rather than a more hypothetical problem. There are other models, the rural studio at Auburn, which has been a long-running program, which is a design build studio. So again, I think we could talk about perhaps in a future session as to kind of the histories of some of these types of teachings and studios, and their effectiveness across history and their relevance, I guess, in the current time. But we have one more question that I wanted, to invite the person who's asked it to ask, or I'm happy to read it, but that's by Abu Tala Faruqi. Abu, do you want to ask this on the mic?
Yeah. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, thanks, Priya. No, I was just interested in this whole, because we kind of keep talking about this in the studio and in various platforms, where basically the reference point is colonialism or modernism, and we are always trying to counter it, and we are always trying to, prove a point that we are basically post-colonial or critically regionalist, etc., etc. But many a times what happens is that during all of these discussions, the key thing, which is basically the relation of knowledge to power, is sometimes not actively brought out into the discussion, which kind of makes it very, very open and prone to various kinds of appropriation. So the whole intention of decoloniality, which with which it basically started, has now been majorly co-opted and appropriated by various forms of nationalism, nativism, and all those kinds of things. So the irony is that basically the critical regionalism itself kind of completely falls into or gives ways into very, very pure uncritical regionalism, right? So I just wanted to kind of have that thing as a comment or as a question, that what do you guys think about it?
Um, that- yes, I can respond about Faruqi. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Because when we use colonial, and I'm also personally speaking, I'm also tired of using these words. Honestly speaking, because especially it right now, after using these terms for a very long time, it creates a confusion. I mean that when it's, as you said, it's being appropriated by the the outside of academia, colonial and decolonial can create a very simplistic binaries between the whites and the browns and the natives and regionalists and others. So I mean that the critical age that these words used to have, you can say that of course it's kind of wearing off right now. So maybe we need to probably change the vocabularies or theoretical framework. One of your proposed framework is to introduce power instead of using colonial, post-colonial, of course, like Foucauldian framework of power, etc. But I totally agree that maybe we can start to think using this word colonial, decolonial in the historic time. I mean that how the word has been changed over the time, how the discourse has evolved over the time, and exactly how academia, when we're using this word, exactly what is our context using it, and whether we can critically engage using these words. I totally agree with you. That can open. I just want to very briefly respond to Isaac's question. Who is an architect, right? What is the architect's job, etc. I want to approach this question from a very different perspective. What is the legal definition of architects? And that is a big question, I think, for the institute. Who is, from the perspective of law? Let's say we have a dispute with our client. Someone died, our laborer dies, and etc. Or the client is dissatisfied, have a lawsuit against the farm. Then how the court is define the profession, and this is just kind of a provocation for you and for the team, that this is also our opportunity to look at how the legal system has defined, how the history of defining architecture from the legal perspective in India and outside of India. And that is a provocation. Let's say we go into the court, how the lawyers are framing this profession. The reason it's a provocation, I'm not going to answer, but this is a new research area that some PhD student can take it up. But I can just share one of my experience, our experience from the U.S. just before the Iran invasion. Probably Priya knows that Trump administration has said that architecture is no longer a professional degree in the U.S. What does it even mean? I mean that it means that our students, all of our students who are coming to the institute, they are taking student loan. When the administration is redefining architecture is not being a professional degree anymore, there is a cap on their loan, right? So they have less financial resources to take from the bank. What does it mean? It means that now we have to redesign the curriculum because we have to reduce the credit hours because our student cannot afford to take that much loan. So this is again just a provocation. How, Isaac's question that who is an architect? So there is institutions way to define architects way, practitioners architects is their way to define architects. There is a legal system, the court, how the courts are defining architects, and that is also have a history, and then the financial institutions who are also defining who is architects. And all of these institutional representations or interpretations of who is architect has their own history. If you look at the past 100 years, everything is changing and evolving. As a provocation, I stop here, Priya. I know that we are way above time.
Yes. No, we are right on time. We usually keep an hour and a half for these, so we're right at that spot. And I know there is a lot that everybody probably wants to say.
I just wanted to come in, sorry,
Yes.
Priya, just a response to Abu Tala's question and the
Yes,
discussion
absolutely.
around power that was happening before this. And I think we should be a little careful about the use of the word power, because it has many pitfalls associated with it as well. I mean, which we can't see. Probably the word we can look at is agency. You know, who has agency, who has voice, and that could be a way to actually really redesign how we engage, because what we are teaching is ours most of the time. Architects are also have a very controversial sort of relationship with the clients, because they think that the clients are just there to let them do what they want to do, and their job is to just provide them with the project and the monies. But and there's a very adversarial sort of relationship. The minute you start talking about whose voice needs to be heard, who has agency in decision making, how the decision making processes of something take place within the larger context, that might change the way we actually engage radically with this thing. Just some thoughts.
I think that's a great note to end this on. I want to just thank all our speakers today for sharing their research and their work, and to Badri for offering those comments, and to all the audience for engaging in this really kind of lively discussion. So we hope to see you for our next session next month, which is going to be on a different theme, but sign up for all of them, and that way you can join in when you can. And as always, you can find them all on our YouTube, all of these talks on the YouTube channel and through the website. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you. I wanted to thank Parul, Priya,
yes, Parul
and Amit
is right.
for
Absolutely.
having me.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And I think Parul is on the talk now because she couldn't join at the beginning. So again, yes, thank you, Parul, for inviting
Priya, I
Badri and
I
Amrita.
want to take a moment to talk about the next PATIO.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So
Sure.
we have the next PATIO conversation, which is coordinated by myself and Yakin Kinger, is on writing histories, which where we'll be looking at religion and architecture's relationship and its history. And we also we have two confirmed speakers, Penny Uni and Sarah Arthur, and Steve Legg as our respondent. So please join us for that next session on 11th June. So we will be sending out the invites for that very soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Saptarshi. I think that is it. And again, thank you all for being here.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.